Let's start with a fact that should kind of short-circuit your brain. Every single country on Earth is in debt. I'm talking the United States, China, Germany, Japan, you name it, they owe a ton of money. Now that right there, that should make you pause, because it creates a paradox that is, well, frankly, it's terrifying.
So how much are we talking about? The total pile of global debt is around $315 trillion. That number is so huge, it's practically meaningless to us. But to put it in perspective, that's 3 times the size of the entire global economy. Everything we make, sell, and do on this planet in a year. You'd have to do it for 3 years straight just to match the debt.
And this leads to the one question that unlocks this whole thing. If everyone, every country, owes money, who exactly is the lender? Who did we borrow all this cash from? Martians? The answer, as it turns out, is not that simple, and it's way more disturbing. Because this system, this giant, inescapable mountain of debt, it didn't just happen. This wasn't some kind of economic accident. No, it was built, deliberately, piece by piece, by 4 key people over the last 300 years. They designed a trap, and, well, we're all in it.
So, let's start at the beginning. Let's meet the guy who laid the foundation, the man who had the truly radical idea of making government debt a forever thing.
His name was William Patterson. He was a Scottish merchant back in the late 1600s. See, back then, when a king needed money for, say, a war, he'd borrow it, and then he'd either pay it back or, just decide not to. Debt was a temporary headache. But Patterson, he came up with a much better idea. Well, better for the lenders, anyway.
Picture this. It's 1694. England is broke and needs money for a war with France. Patterson comes along with this genius pitch. He says, "A group of my rich friends will lend the king 1.2 million pounds. And here's the kicker. You never have to pay us back the 1.2 million. Ever. Just pay us 8% interest on it forever." It was basically the world's first subscription service, and the product was money. But this is where it gets truly wild. The new Bank of England, which was created just to manage this deal, was given the right to print banknotes that were backed by this government debt. All of a sudden, the government's IOU, its promise to pay interest, became actual spendable money. Think about that. The more the government borrowed, the more the bank could literally create out of thin air. The trap was officially set. So, Patterson created the blueprint for permanent debt. But our next architect, he took that blueprint and turned it into an inescapable global system. Enter Nathan Rothschild. In the early 1800s, this guy basically industrialized government debt. He wasn't just lending to one government. He created a market where you could buy and sell the debt of many governments. He started weaving it all together into this massive international financial web. And he cemented his power with one of the slickest moves in financial history. The year is 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's future hangs in the balance. Thanks to his own private, super-fast courier network, Rothschild finds out that Napoleon lost hours before the official government messenger gets back to London. So what does he do? He goes to the stock exchange and starts selling British bonds like crazy. The whole market freaks out. The thinking was, oh my God, Rothschild is selling. He knows something. Britain must have lost the war. So everybody starts panic selling their bonds and the price just collapses. Then, right at the bottom, Rothschild's agents secretly swoop in and buy up practically the entire market for pennies on the dollar. A few hours later, the official news of victory arrives, bond prices skyrocket, and Rothschild makes an obscene amount of money. But this wasn't just about getting rich. This move showed his real innovation. By making government debt something that bankers and investors all over Europe owned, he created this interconnected web. After this, a country couldn't just decide not to pay its debt, because doing so would trigger a financial heart attack across the entire continent. Governments were now prisoners of the system. Okay, so now debt is permanent, and it's global. But there was still a limit, right? You could only borrow the money that actually existed. Our third architect, well, he took care of that little problem.
Let's talk about J.P. Morgan. Back in 1907, the U.S. financial system almost completely collapsed, and Morgan himself had to personally organize a bailout. Afterwards, he and his buddies decided they needed a more permanent solution. The problem was, Americans hated the idea of a European-style central bank, so they got together in secret and designed one anyway.
And the way they sold it was pure political genius. First, don't call it a central bank. Call it the Federal Reserve System. Much friendlier. Second, make it look decentralized, with 12 different regional banks all over the country. Put a public board in charge, appointed by the president. But here's the secret sauce.
The regional Fed banks are actually owned by the private banks in their district. The real power, the ability to create money and buy government debt, was cleverly handed over to Wall Street.
And that was the key. The Fed could now literally create money out of nothing, specifically to buy government bonds. This meant there would always be a buyer for U.S. debt. Before the Fed, there was a natural limit to how much the government could borrow. After the Fed was created, the limit was gone. The debt trap was now infinite.
So the machine is almost perfect. But there was one last loophole. What happens when a country is so broke it simply can't pay the interest anymore? Our final architect slammed that door shut. This is Paul Volcker. He was the chairman of the Fed in the late 70s and 80s. To fight runaway inflation, he cranked interest rates way up. This worked, but it accidentally pushed a bunch of developing countries who had borrowed tons of US dollars to the brink of bankruptcy. Mexico was about to default, which would have taken down some of the biggest American banks with it. A real crisis.
Volcker's solution, which he ran through the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was not to forgive the debt. Oh no. Instead, the IMF gave these countries new loans, just enough money so they could keep paying the interest they owed to the big Western banks. But these weren't friendly loans. They came with some brutal strings attached. In exchange for the bailout, these countries had to give up control over their own economies. They had to privatize their state-owned industries, open their markets to foreign companies, essentially hand over the keys.
And there you have it. 4 architects, 4 key innovations. When you put all the pieces together, you can finally see the complete machine they built.
It's a 4-step process. First, Patterson makes government debt permanent. Then, Rothschild weaves it into a global web you can't break. After that, Morgan creates a central bank that can print infinite money to buy all that debt. And finally, Volcker designs the endgame. When a country can't pay, you don't forgive the debt. You use it to take control.
So let's go back to our very first question. Who do we owe all this money to? Well, when you look at it, the answer is just weird. A huge chunk is owned by the American public in things like pension funds. Another big slice is owned by the government itself in accounts like Social Security. So you, the taxpayer, pay taxes to the government, who then pays interest to institutions that are managing your own retirement money. It's a closed loop.
And here's the final, most mind-bending part of all. The system can never be fixed by paying off the debt, because in our modern economy, most money is created when a loan is made. If the government somehow paid off all $30-something trillion of its debt, the money supply would effectively disappear, and it would trigger an economic collapse that would make the Great Depression look like a minor dip. The debt isn't a problem with the system, the debt is the system.
Which leaves us with one last thought. We're always told that this giant pile of debt is a crisis, a huge problem we have to solve for our kids. But what if it's not a crisis? What if it's not a bug, but the main feature? What if it's a business model, working perfectly, exactly the way its architects planned all along?